My father refused to help me with college because I don't want to accept his new wife after he left my mother and me at the worst possible time. When I asked my father for help paying for college, he refused. Not because he couldn't afford it, but because I didn't accept his new wife, the same woman he left my mother and me for when we needed him the most. He abandoned us, barely supported us, and now, years later, he called me selfish for asking for help. And that's not even the worst part. For most of my life, my parents were together. There were arguments, but nothing that seemed unusual. We didn't have much money, but we managed. My father worked long hours, and my mother handled everything at home. Then, things changed. A woman from my father's job started appearing in conversations. He mentioned her often, at first casually. Then, he began coming home later. His attitude shifted, less patience, more distance. At first, my mother dismissed it, but eventually, it became obvious. One day, he left. There was no discussion, just a decision he had already made. He moved in with her, and soon after, they got married. At first, he sent money. It was less than before, but it helped. Over time, the amounts got smaller. Eventually, it was barely enough to cover anything. He stopped asking how things were at home. He didn't check in. He had moved on. His absence changed everything. My mother worked more, but it was never enough. I learned to handle things alone. His new life had no space for us after my father left. Nothing was the same. My mother tried to hold things together, but it was difficult. She took extra shifts, doing whatever she could to cover bills. Even then, money was tight. I stopped asking for things I didn't absolutely need. Every dollar counted. At first, my father sent support regularly, though it was much less than when he lived with us. Over time, the payments became smaller and less frequent. My mother never complained to him, but I could see the stress every time a bill came in. He never asked if we were okay, never checked if we needed anything beyond the money he sent. Eventually, he stopped sending anything at all. I stopped expecting anything from him. Birthdays passed without a call. Holidays went by without a message. It became clear that he had a new life, and we were not part of it. I heard from family members that he and his new wife went on vacations, bought a new house, and lived comfortably. Meanwhile, my mother and I struggled to afford the basics. By the time I was old enough to work, I took any job I could find. I worked late nights, weekends, and holidays. Every dollar went toward helping my mother or saving for college. I had no safety net, no backup plan. If I wanted a future, I had to make it happen myself. Years passed, and I accepted that my father was gone in every way that mattered. He never reached out, and I never tried to contact him. He had made his choice, and I had moved on. Then, one day, everything changed. He reappeared. For years, my father was just a name on paper. He had no presence in my life. He sent less and less money until he stopped entirely. He never called, never asked how I was doing, never showed any interest in my life. I had accepted that he was gone. Then, out of nowhere, he came back. It started with a short message. It wasn't an apology, not even an acknowledgement of the years he had been absent. It was casual, like he hadn't ignored me for most of my life. He asked how I was doing, said he had been thinking about me, and that he wanted to meet up. At first, I ignored it. I didn't trust him. I had gone my entire teenage years without him, and I didn't need him now. But then, he messaged again. This time, he said he wanted to make up for lost time. I wasn't sure what to do. My mother told me it was my choice, but I could tell she didn't trust him either. She had never spoken badly about him, even after he left us struggling, but I knew how much she had suffered because of him. Curiosity got the best of me. I agreed to meet. When I saw him, he looked different. He was older, more tired. He smiled, acted excited to see me, but there was something off. He was too nice, too eager. He asked about my life, my job, my future plans. For the first time in years, he acted like a father. I wanted to believe he had changed, but it didn't add up. He had ignored me for so long, and now suddenly he cared? It didn't make sense. Then, I found out the truth. His life with his new wife wasn't as perfect as he had made it seem. She controlled everything. His money, his time, his decisions. At first, he didn't mind. He had left his old life behind for her, so he accepted it. But over the years, things changed. She went out often, spent his money, and barely paid attention to him. He wasn't the priority in her life the way he had expected to be. It was only after years of being pushed aside that he started to realize what he had done. He had left his family for this woman, and now she treated him like an afterthought. He felt isolated, and suddenly, he wanted to reconnect. At first, I didn't know how to feel. A part of me wanted to shut him out, remind him that he had abandoned us first. But another part of me saw something different, regret. It wasn't enough to undo everything he had done, but for the first time, he seemed to understand the damage he had caused. He tried to rebuild his relationship with me and even reached out to my mother. She was polite but distant. She had moved on, and she wasn't going to let him back in just because he suddenly decided he wanted to fix things. Over time, I let my guard down slightly. I didn't forgive him, but I gave him a chance to prove he had changed. He made an effort. He asked about my life, helped when I needed advice, and acted like he wanted to be part of my future. Then, his wife noticed. She realized he was trying to reconnect with the family he had left behind. And she didn't like it. That's when everything got worse. As my father tried to fix his relationship with me, his wife started paying more attention. She had ignored his regrets for a long time, assuming he had fully committed to his life with her. But when she saw him trying to reconnect with me and my mother, she stepped in. At first, it was subtle. She started making more effort in their marriage. She became more affectionate, more involved, and acted like the caring partner my father had wanted her to be. He had spent years feeling neglected by her, and now, suddenly, she was the perfect wife. It was clear what was happening. She saw that he was drifting back toward his old family, and she wanted to pull him back. My father didn't see it immediately. He believed she had changed, that she genuinely wanted to make things better. He still wanted to fix things with me, but his time became more limited. He canceled plans, made excuses, and started slipping back into old patterns. I saw it coming. I had spent years without his presence, so it wasn't hard to recognize when he was pulling away again. This time, though, I wasn't the child he had left behind. I was older, and I wasn't going to wait around for him to choose whether or not he wanted to be in my life. He still tried, but his efforts became weaker. His wife wasn't happy that he was staying in contact with me, and she made that clear. She started making comments about how I was trying to come between them, how I was only reaching out because I wanted something from him. She reminded him that I had never accepted her, that I had always held a grudge. Eventually, it worked. One day, my father offered for me to move in with him. He said he wanted to make up for the past, to give me the support he hadn't given before. I refused. His wife still lived there, and I had no interest in being part of that situation. He didn't argue. He understood. That should have been the end of it. But his wife saw my refusal as proof that I was against her. She took it personally, as if I was rejecting him out of spite rather than out of self-respect. From then on, she made sure to remind him that I was selfish, that I was only interested in what he could give me. And when I finally asked him for real help, for the first time in years, she used it against me. That's when everything fell apart again. College tuition was more than I could handle alone. I had been working as much as possible, taking extra shifts, and cutting every unnecessary expense. But no matter how much I saved, it wasn't enough. The deadlines were approaching, and I had exhausted every option. I had no financial aid left to cover the gap. I needed help. I didn't want to ask my father. I had spent years without relying on him for anything, and I hated the idea of going to him now. But after everything, after all his talk about wanting to fix things, I thought maybe this time would be different. He had a good job, he wasn't struggling financially, and if he truly wanted to make up for the past, this was his chance. Before I could even speak to him directly, his wife found out. She saw my request before he did, and she took control of the situation immediately. Instead of letting him hear it from me, she told him her version first. She framed it in a way that made me look like the villain. She told him I wasn't asking for help. I was demanding money. She claimed I was acting entitled, trying to guilt him into paying for something he had no obligation to cover. She said I didn't care about him, only about what he could give me. She reminded him that I had never accepted her, that I had always treated her with hostility, and now I was expecting them to give me thousands of dollars as if I had any right to it. By the time my father responded, it was clear that she had one. His message was short and cold. There was no discussion, no concern about why I needed help or what I had done to try to manage on my own. There was no mention of the fact that he had left us struggling while he built a comfortable life with his new wife. He didn't ask how I was managing all this time without him. He accused me of being selfish. He said I only came to him when I needed something, as if I had ignored him for years instead of the other way around. He told me that if I had been more respectful to his wife, maybe things would be different. There was no anger in his words, just disappointment, like I was the one who had abandoned him. Like I was the one who had broken the family apart. That was when I knew there was nothing left to salvage. I had spent years trying to move on from what he had done, trying to live without his help. The moment I asked for one thing, something that could genuinely change my future, he turned it against me. It wasn't about the money. It was about control. His wife had made him choose, and he had chosen her again. After reading his response, I felt nothing at first. I had expected him to say no. I had spent years watching him distance himself, giving less and less until there was nothing left. But this wasn't just about refusing to help. He had made it clear that in his eyes, I was the problem. I sat there, rereading his words, knowing that no amount of explaining would change his mind. He had always put his wife first, and this time was no different. She had framed me as an ungrateful, selfish child, and he had believed her without question. He had ignored the fact that I had worked for everything I had, that I had done everything on my own while he lived comfortably without a second thought about me. I thought about responding, about defending myself. I wanted to tell him that I hadn't come to him out of greed, that I had exhausted every option before even considering asking for help. I wanted to remind him of the years I spent without his support, the times I needed him, and he wasn't there. I wanted to ask why he thought I owed his wife anything when she was part of the reason he had walked away in the first place, but none of it mattered. He had already decided who he was going to believe. I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I didn't try to change his mind. Instead, I blocked his number. There was nothing left to say. I had spent my entire childhood learning how to live without him, and I would continue to do so. It wasn't fair. I had done nothing to deserve this. But life had already shown me that fairness didn't matter. I would find another way to pay for school. I would work harder, take on more shifts, apply for more aid. It would be difficult, but I had no choice. I wasn't going to beg someone who had already chosen to turn his back on me. As far as I was concerned, my father was gone. He had left when I was a child. Now, I was making sure he never had a way back. Blocking my father's number was the final step. I had spent years holding on to the small possibility that he might change, that maybe one day he would realize what he had done and make things right. But now I knew the truth. He wasn't coming back, at least not in any way that mattered. I focused on what I could control. I worked extra shifts, applied for every scholarship and grant I could find, and cut expenses wherever possible. It was exhausting, but I refused to let this stop me. If my father wanted to believe I was selfish, then so be it. I would prove, to myself, not to him, that I never needed his help in the first place. My mother supported me as much as she could. She had done everything for me growing up, and I refused to let her carry the burden alone. She never spoke badly about my father, but I could see the pain in her eyes when I told her what happened. She had always hoped that he would step up one day, but now she saw what I had already accepted. He was never going to change. Months passed, and I made progress. It wasn't easy, but I made it work. I balanced school and work, exhausted but determined. I stopped thinking about my father. I stopped wondering if he would reach out again, if he would ever try to fix what he had broken. I had given him enough chances. Then, unexpectedly, he reached out again. It was a short message. He said he wanted to talk, that he didn't want things to end like this. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge what he had done. He just acted like we had a simple misunderstanding, as if years of neglect and rejection could be erased with a few words. I didn't respond. For the first time in my life, I felt nothing toward him. No anger, no sadness, no resentment. Just indifference. I had already moved forward. He was the one left behind. Ignoring my father's message should have felt like closure, but instead, it left me questioning everything. Cutting him off was the right decision, but a part of me still wondered if I had handled it the best way. Maybe I should have confronted him. Maybe I should have told him exactly how much damage he had done, how his choices had affected me. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't have mattered. He had already rewritten the story in his mind. To him, I was the ungrateful child who refused to accept his new life. Nothing I said would change that. I still think about the past, but I don't regret moving on. I worked my way through college, taking on jobs whenever I could. It was harder than it needed to be, but I did it without him. I didn't need his approval, his money, or his presence. But part of me still wonders, did I do the right thing? Should I have responded one last time, if only to make him understand why I shut him out? Or was it pointless to explain myself to someone who never really saw me as his responsibility? I don't know. What would you have done in my place?